The worst sound I have ever heard in my life wasn't a scream or a crash or the unmistakable crack of bone. It was the sound of my own breath recorded at 3:17 a.m., followed by a moment of absolute clinical silence, and then a faint, wet exhalation that wasn't mine, immediately followed by the sound of something shifting weight directly beside the mattress. The noise was so close, so intimate that it sounded like whoever, or whatever, it was had been leaning over me, inches from my ear just watching me sleep. And then a perfect, chilling whisper, sharp and final, cutting through the silence of the deepest part of the night. My name. My name spoken with a familiarity that implied ownership, laced with a subtle, rising inflection that suggested surprise, or maybe triumph. That single, 4-second audio clip is still saved on an old cloud server, and I know, logically, that deleting it won't erase what happened. But I can't listen to it anymore. I'm only telling you this now because I need someone else to hold the weight of it, even if you're just listening through speakers in the dark. I moved to Astoria, Oregon 3 years ago. Not the touristy part. I bought a small, two-story house nestled deep in the damp hills above the city, where the coastal fog rolls in thick and soundless, and the houses are spaced far enough apart that you can't hear your neighbor's life, even if you try. I'm a data analyst, which means my world revolves around silence and deep concentration. I need quiet the way some people need coffee. The city noise, the constant rumble of traffic, the sirens, the background static of 5 million people, was making me actively miserable. This house was perfect. It was built in the late 1960s, a timber frame structure with large, drafty windows and a back porch that looked out onto a wall of dense, dripping Sitka spruce. The air always smelled like moss and salt and decay. There were no streetlights on my small, winding road, just the enormous, oppressive blackness of the woods. My routine was rigid, almost ceremonial. I'd wake up at 7, make coffee, and start work by 7:45 a.m. I'd finish around 4, spend an hour trying to fix some chronic issue with the plumbing or the foundation. Old houses demand sacrifice, and then I'd eat a light dinner. By 10 o'clock, the house was dark and silent. I cherished that silence. It was the purest sound I had ever encountered, thick and insulating. For the first 6 months, life was perfect. I slept deeply, 8 full hours, undisturbed by anything except maybe the occasional far-off foghorn or the howling of a distant coyote. The trouble started subtly, almost imperceptibly, as genuine psychological horror often does. It began with the exhaustion. I was sleeping, yes, but I wasn't rested. I'd wake up feeling as though I had run a marathon in my dreams. My neck was always stiff, and I started developing the kind of stress headaches that feel like cold metal is tightening around your skull. I initially suspected apnea. Sleep apnea is terrifyingly common, and I hated the idea of disrupting my quiet nights with loud, rattling snores. To track it, I downloaded a generic sleep monitoring app, one of those free trials that promise to analyze your sleep cycles and record any ambient sounds that occur while you're supposedly unconscious. The first week of recordings was utterly boring. The audio tracks were mostly flat lines, punctuated by my own regular, soft breathing and the occasional distant thump of the refrigerator kicking on downstairs. I felt reassured. No obvious snoring, no unusual noise intrusion. I decided the exhaustion must be work-related stress, and I planned to delete the app at the end of the trial period. Then came the second week. I was reviewing the morning data, a habit I had foolishly started, when I noticed a spike in the middle of the night's graph. Around 2:45 a.m. it wasn't loud enough to trigger the app's significant event alert, but it was visually prominent. I slid the timeline marker back and pressed play. I heard the quiet, rhythmic sound of my own inhalation and exhalation, then a distinct, soft noise. It sounded like wood shifting on wood, maybe a door settling or a floorboard contracting in the cold. It was muffled, almost subterranean. I listened 3 times, isolating the frequency. Just the house, I muttered to the empty room, closing the app. Old timber structures are living things. They breathe, they sigh, they pop and crack. It was normal, especially in the damp environment of coastal Oregon. I was overthinking it. But the next night the spike happened again, and this time it was louder. I woke up feeling that familiar, clammy dread. I poured coffee and went straight to the app. 3:07 a.m. I found the segment. The wood creak was back, but this time it was closer. It sounded like it originated from the hallway just outside my bedroom door, which I always kept slightly ajar to let air circulate. I sat there staring at the phone screen, holding my breath in the morning silence. I played it again. Creak. It wasn't a sudden, stressful sound. It was the slow, deliberate protest of an old floorboard taking weight, the type of sound a cautious person makes when trying not to be heard. My heart rate jumped. I tried to reason it away. It must be the temperature dropping, the house cooling down and shrinking. But the temperature in the house was regulated by a smart thermostat. It barely fluctuated at night. I spent the rest of the day in a haze of mild anxiety, replaying that sound clip in my head. When I got off work, I methodically walked the entire second floor, stepping on every floorboard trying to reproduce that exact frequency. I couldn't. The boards near my room were solid, carpeted, and didn't groan unless I stomped on them. The sound on the recording was lighter, stealthier. That night, for the first time since moving in, I checked all the windows and doors. The woods outside were pitch black, silent, and intimidating. I pulled the heavy, blackout curtains shut, and despite the fact that I had never done it before, I locked my bedroom door. I lay in bed waiting for the sound. The silence was suddenly oppressive, not insulating. It felt like a vacuum ready to be filled. My ears strained, listening for the faint settling or cracking. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I slipped into an uneasy sleep. The morning review was a routine I now dreaded. I felt like an amateur forensic scientist dissecting evidence I didn't want to find. I opened the app. The graph for the night was erratic. There were several small spikes clustered between 3:00 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. I played the first one. It was the same noise, the soft, deliberate creak. I played the second. A moment of silence, then a very faint scuffing sound, like fabric brushing against plaster. I played the third around 3:28 a.m. This sound was different. It wasn't the house settling. It was too regular, too rhythmic. It was a sound I could only describe as someone softly clearing their throat, followed by a barely audible, indistinct sigh. This time my hands started to shake. The throat clearing was clearly mammalian, definitely human. It wasn't a cough or a sneeze. It was a quiet, preparatory sound. And it was close. If the sound was real, it meant someone had been standing outside my locked bedroom door for at least 30 minutes, breathing, listening, waiting. I shot out of bed, adrenaline surging, and ran downstairs. I checked the main door, locked, deadbolted, windows locked. There was no sign of forced entry, no mud on the carpet, no displaced items. The house was exactly as I had left it. The kitchen clock read 7:35 a.m. I tried to rationalize this using every logical tool in my analytical toolkit. Hypothesis A: auditory bleed over. Maybe the app was picking up residual sound waves from an old recording or a radio signal. Unlikely. The sounds were too perfectly situated within the recording of my own quiet breathing. Hypothesis B: a neighbor or animal. Impossible. The neighbors were hundreds of yards away, and the subtle sounds were indoor noises. Hypothesis C: the house is haunted. I stopped myself there. I don't believe in ghosts. I believe in data, reality, and verifiable facts. I refuse to let my mind slip into fantasy. The most terrifying logical conclusion was that someone had found a way into the house, perhaps while I was awake and working, and was hiding somewhere, waiting for the dead of night to move. But where? The house wasn't huge. I did a frantic room-by-room search, peering into every closet, checking the small crawl space access panels, looking under beds. Nothing. The psychological toll started immediately. My routine, my anchor, was destroyed. I couldn't concentrate on work because half my brain was dedicated to internal noise analysis. Was that the wind, a water pipe, or a footfall? I didn't tell anyone. How could I? Hey, I'm being haunted by vague, 2-second audio clips of someone clearing their throat while I'm asleep. I'd sound unhinged. Instead, I became obsessive. I bought a second phone, strictly dedicated to recording. I placed it on the dresser, facing the bedroom door. I downloaded specialized noise analysis software for my computer, software designed to isolate specific frequencies and filter out white noise. I was turning into a vigilante audiophile, determined to prove that the sounds were either manufactured or real. I stopped sleeping past 1:00 a.m. for several days. I tried to force myself to stay awake, sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes wide in the dark, my breath held tight in my chest. I'd listen until my head throbbed, waiting for a creak, a rustle, anything that would match the recordings. The irony was devastating. When I was awake, the house was perfectly, absolutely silent. The woods outside held their breath. When I eventually succumbed to exhaustion, usually around 3:30 a.m., I would sleep for maybe 9 minutes before waking up in a cold sweat. The nights blurred into a cycle of fear and technological review. One morning, after reviewing the files, I found something that broke through my wall of denial. It was captured on both phones, confirming it wasn't an application error. The recording from 4:05 a.m. was different. It wasn't a creak or a breath. It was a distinct, wet scraping sound. It lasted about 5 seconds. Using the spectral analysis software, I could see the distinct waveform, a complex, ragged sound profile that did not match wood, metal, or water. I played it back 10 times, increasing the gain, trying to clean up the hiss of the low-quality recording. It sounded like something heavy and awkward being dragged very slowly across a rough surface, perhaps the linoleum in the kitchen downstairs. The implications paralyzed me. If someone was dragging something across the kitchen floor, they were deep inside the house, moving freely. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed and crept downstairs, heart hammering against my ribs. The kitchen was pristine. The linoleum tiles were flawless. Nothing was out of place. The chairs were tucked in, the dishes were clean. It was a perfect, innocuous suburban kitchen bathed in weak morning light. If the sound happened, where did it come from? And what was being dragged? I spent the next 3 hours examining the entire floor of the house. I used a flashlight, searching for scrapes, dirt, or signs of disruption. Nothing. The kitchen floor, the living room hardwoods, they were all untouched. The doubt started eating away at my sense of reality. Was the stress finally breaking me? Was I inducing auditory hallucinations, and the phone app was simply responding to the electrical impulses in my exhausted brain? I felt the need to share this, to get a professional opinion, but the thought of handing over these cryptic, terrifying recordings to a doctor or a policeman felt insane. They would recommend therapy, not a stakeout. So I escalated my efforts in secret. I set up a secondary recording device in the living room downstairs, hidden in a stack of old magazines. This device, unlike the phone app, recorded constantly, not just when activated by sound. I was looking for the source, the spatial positioning of the noise. For 2 days, the downstairs recorder picked up nothing but the occasional vibration of a passing truck on the remote road. The upstairs recordings, however, were getting bolder. On Wednesday of that week, I reviewed the file from 2:59 a.m. My breathing was steady, slow. Then a low, rhythmic noise began. It sounded like tapping, but soft, almost cushioned. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random. It was a pattern of 3 beats, pausing and repeating. It was subtle, almost drowned out by my own breathing. I focused the analysis software on it. The rhythm was precisely spaced, 1.2 seconds between taps. What was it? I spent an hour wandering the house the next day, tapping every object, trying to match the frequency and duration. It didn't sound like wood or glass or metal. It sounded soft, yielding, almost like a finger tapping lightly on thick, upholstered fabric. I realized with a cold certainty that the only object in my bedroom that matched that description was my mattress. The tapping sound was originating from inside my room, possibly from the space under my bed, or perhaps right on the edge of the mattress, inches from my head. The realization sent a spike of pure, raw terror through me. Whatever it wasn't outside. It wasn't downstairs. It wasn't even in the hallway. It was in the room with me, every single night. The psychological tension became unbearable. I wasn't just tired. I was physically vibrating with suppressed fear. My focus at work evaporated. I started making elementary mistakes in my data sets. My colleagues noticed the delay in my responses, asking if I was feeling okay. I'd lie, citing a bad flu. My relationship with the house shifted completely. It ceased to be a refuge and became a cage. Every shadow was suspect, every shift of light a potential movement. I developed an intense, painful paranoia about turning my back on corners. I started sleeping with the baseball bat balanced precariously on my chest, ready to swing. But the worst effect was the dread of the phone. I needed the recordings. I needed the verification that I wasn't going mad, that the sounds were objectively real. Yet, checking the phone in the morning felt like voluntarily walking into a torture chamber. I started drinking heavily at night, not to get drunk, but to numb the hypervigilance enough to pass out. Alcohol dulls the senses, slows the internal processing, allowing for a temporary, fragile collapse into sleep. The drinking introduced a new variable. On a Friday night, after 2 glasses of whiskey, I set up the recorders and passed out quickly, fully clothed. The next morning, the hangover was crushing, but the necessity of checking the files was greater. I grabbed the phone, my hand trembling slightly. The graph was wild. There were massive spikes, far louder than anything I'd heard before. I skipped straight to the worst segment around 4:18 a.m. I pressed play. First, my own heavy, alcohol-induced breathing, thick and ragged. Then a sudden, sharp thud. It sounded like a body hitting the floor. And then the voices. They weren't whispers, they weren't murmurs. They were low-pitched but clear. 2 distinct voices, one slightly higher pitched, definitely male, and one lower, guttural, gender ambiguous. I couldn't make out the words immediately. They were speaking softly but not attempting to whisper or hide. They sounded conversational, mundane, as if discussing laundry or dinner plans. But they were right there, inches from the phone. I uploaded the file immediately to my computer and ran the full suite of forensic audio filters. I spent 3 excruciating hours eliminating the static and the low-frequency hum of the fan. When the cleaned audio played back, I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. The higher voice said slowly, distinctly, "He's out." The lower voice responded with a dry, soft chuckle. It wasn't a joke, but a sound of simple, satisfied amusement. Then the low voice spoke one word: "Good." Then came the sounds that haunted me the most. The sounds of movement. Not the careful, stealthy movements of a burglar, but the unhurried, heavy-footed shuffling of people who felt completely safe, completely in control of the space. The scraping noise from a few days ago was back, but louder. I finally isolated it. It wasn't metal or wood. It sounded like the coarse, fibrous material of a heavy burlap sack being dragged across the carpet, followed by a slight, metallic clink. The final words of the recording were the most terrifying. The low voice, closer now, almost inhaling the microphone. "We should check the windows again. Too much light." The clip ended with the sharp sound of my bedroom door closing. This time, firmly, definitively, as if sealing me inside or sealing them out. I sat there frozen, the sunlight streaming through the window contradicting the cold dread rising up my throat. They were not hiding. They were operating. They were physically in my room, standing over me, discussing the light coming through my windows. And the fact that I was passed out, was a confirmation, not a problem. The implications were catastrophic. This wasn't some random break-in. This was deliberate, structured, and worst of all, ongoing. I immediately called the local police, struggling to keep my voice even, rational. "I have reason to believe there was an intruder in my house last night," I managed. The officer who responded, a large man named Jenkins with a tired face, listened to my account patiently, taking notes. He surveyed the house quickly. "Mr. Davis, I'm seeing no sign of forced entry, no displacement, no damage. You say you were drinking last night." I hesitated. "Yes, but the recordings are clear. I have audio proof." I played the filtered clip for him, emphasizing the voices and the word, "good." He listened, his expression neutral. When it finished, he tapped his pen against his pad. "It's certainly an unsettling noise, sir. However, without visible evidence, a print, a broken window, something stolen, this is categorized as an acoustic anomaly. It could be residual static or, frankly, the acoustics of an old house playing tricks. We'll log the complaint. If anything is broken or if you hear someone talking while you're awake, call us immediately." He left, polite but dismissive. I understood. My evidence was electronic and ambiguous. I felt intensely isolated, trapped between the undeniable reality of the audio files and the frustrating silence of the physical world. I stopped going downstairs completely. I moved my work setup into the small spare room upstairs, sleeping on a temporary cot in the corner, far from the main bedroom where the voices had been so clear. I started a new protocol. I would record continuously, from the moment I lay down until the moment I woke up, using 3 separate devices. The recordings became my window into my own vulnerability. It was terrifying to know that while I was conscious, the house was mine, but the moment I surrendered to sleep, it belonged to them. The next few days were defined by crushing exhaustion and the cold, sick feeling of waiting. I was barely functioning. I ate canned soup and instant oatmeal, not leaving the upstairs. The recordings continued, less conversational now, perhaps because I was sleeping in a different room. But the sounds were still there. Soft footfalls, the deliberate creak of the door leading to the main bedroom, and a repetitive, low-frequency hum that I couldn't identify. It sounded less like a machine and more like a physical vibration. Then came the Saturday night that broke me completely. I had decided I wasn't going to sleep. I set up my laptop on the floor and drank a pot of coffee and 2 energy drinks, determined to stay awake through the critical hours of 3:00 to 4:00 a.m. I needed to see them. I needed to catch them in the act, or finally accept that I was hallucinating. The spare room was cold. The only light came from the blue glow of the laptop screen. I sat rigid, the baseball bat across my knees, straining my senses against the absolute silence of the woods. Midnight passed, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. My eyes burned. My head pounded with caffeine and tension. I started seeing movement in my peripheral vision. The curtains seemed to twitch. The shadow of a jacket hanging on the hook seemed to shift shape. I knew this was sleep deprivation, but the rational explanation didn't quell the fear. At 3:15 a.m., I felt the inevitable wave of metabolic crash. My muscles relaxed against my will and my vision swam. I fought it, pinching the skin on my arm, slamming my fist against the floorboards. It was pointless. My body demanded rest. I remember turning my head toward the window, the faint image of the dense spruce trees pressing against the glass. I remember thinking, I just need 5 minutes. I woke up at 4:37 a.m. in a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled shock. I hadn't slept for 5 minutes. I had been out for well over an hour. The bat was still in my hand, but my grip was loose. I scrambled for the phones. I had 3 recorders going: phone 1 by the cot, phone 2 in the main bedroom, and the dedicated downstairs recorder. I started with phone 1, the one closest to me. The graph showed a sudden massive spike at 3:45 a.m. I pressed play, and immediately I heard my own ragged, panicked gasp as I realized I was falling asleep. Then a low, wet whisper. This was not the murmuring from before. This was a single, sustained sound, like air being forced out of constricted lungs, right next to the microphone. And then the sound of the zipper. It was unmistakable. The metallic, grinding sound of a zipper being pulled down, slow and deliberate, followed by the soft sound of heavy cloth shifting. Whatever they were doing, they were unzipping something large, bulky, and fabric-covered. My mind raced: a bag, a body bag, a tent. Then the low voice I recognized from the previous recording spoke, but this time it sounded strained, focused on a task. "Hold it steady, don't rush." The higher voice responded, closer to the microphone than ever before, sounding almost like it was leaning over the cot. "It's heavy, God, it's heavy." I heard the sound of what seemed to be a heavy weight being dragged, the same scraping sound but magnified, more desperate. It lasted for a terrifying 30 seconds. The breathing of the intruders was rapid and shallow. Then the scraping stopped, a sigh of relief. And then silence, punctuated only by my shallow, rapid breathing, the sound of me sleeping, utterly vulnerable. I stopped the recording, my mouth dry. They had been in the spare room. They had been moving something heavy right next to me. I immediately grabbed the second phone, the one I had left in the main bedroom, hoping it had captured the origin of the noise. This file was the most devastating. The recording started with the familiar static and my distant breathing. Then, at 3:39 a.m., before they had moved to the spare room, the sound of the main bedroom door clicking shut. I heard the higher-pitched voice first, sounding far away near the window. "The light is bad this time. Should we wait?" The low voice replied, much closer to the phone, sounding impatient. "No, we don't have time. He's going to wake up soon, just get the corners." Then the true horror began. The recording captured a sequence of soft, repeated clicks, interspersed with the sounds of deliberate, rhythmic digging. The clicks sounded like a spade hitting hardened earth or gravel, but the dirt sound was muted, as if the work was happening somewhere enclosed. The rhythm was constant: click, scrape, scrape, click, scrape, scrape. And the low, guttural voice, breathing heavily right next to the phone, mumbled something that I had to play 5 times before I could understand. It wasn't directed at the other person. It was a rhythmic chant, almost a mantra, accompanying the digging. Down deeper, down deeper. My blood turned to ice. They weren't moving things into the house. They were moving things into the floor, into the house itself. The digging continued for nearly 10 minutes, followed by a heavy thud, the sound of dirt or gravel being shoveled back, and the persistent, coarse sound of that heavy fabric being zipped back up. The 2 voices murmured something unintelligible, sounding pleased, and then the clip ended with the soft, stealthy sound of the main bedroom door being opened and closed again. The implication was clear, sharp, and undeniable. They had buried something beneath the floorboards of the main bedroom, while I slept just 20 feet away. The downstairs recorder yielded only ambient no. Ise, suggesting the activity was confined strictly to the second floor. I didn't call the police again. I knew what Jenkins would say: "Mr. Davis, you're hearing things. You're hearing digging sounds in your carpeted bedroom." I felt intensely, terrifyingly alone. I looked down at the floor, at the wall-to-wall carpeting of the spare room, then across the hall to the sealed-off main bedroom. What was buried there? Why were they doing it in my house? Was it some kind of ritual? Was it a warning? I couldn't stay. The fear wasn't paralyzing anymore. It was mobilizing. I wasn't fighting ghosts or hallucinations. I was fighting intruders who were using my periods of sleep as their operational window. I packed one suitcase in 10 minutes, clothes, wallet, laptop. I left the phones charging on the dresser, still recording, knowing they would document my escape. I didn't stop to look for my passport or important papers or even turn off the lights. The house had turned malignant. I needed distance. I ran down the stairs, opened the front door, and sprinted to my car, the key shaking so badly I dropped it twice on the wet gravel driveway. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and cranked the engine. I didn't drive toward town. I drove east, inland, toward the mountains, away from the thick, oppressive silence of the coastal woods. I drove for 6 hours straight, stopping only for gas and black coffee, until I reached the arid, sun-baked landscape of central Oregon. I checked into a cheap, sterile motel in Bend, one of those places with paper-thin walls and constant traffic noise, and I felt safer than I had felt in months. The noise was a blanket, a loud, ugly confirmation that I was surrounded by other human beings, awake and visible. I stayed there for 3 days, reviewing the final recordings from the moment I had left. The phones continued to record the absolute silence of the empty house. On the 3rd day, I finally uploaded the files from phone 2, the one from the main bedroom, and ran one last forensic sweep. I found the 4-second segment from 3:17 a.m. that I mentioned at the beginning of this story. It happened shortly after they finished the digging, just before they moved to the spare room. The breathing, the shift of weight, the closeness. And the whisper, my name. I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't the high-pitched one or the low, guttural one. It was a third voice, soft and breathy like old silk rubbing together. It sounded young, and it sounded like it was right above my face, its breath humid against the microphone. I knew then that the initial sounds, the creaking, the tapping on the mattress, had been them testing my sleep, checking the integrity of my surrender. And on that last night, someone had decided to lean in, confirming my vulnerability with a single, victorious whisper. I immediately shut the laptop, the sheer intimacy of the sound making me physically ill. I deleted the filtering software. I couldn't analyze it further. The data was complete, but the truth was terrifyingly ambiguous. What were they doing? Were they a cult? Traffickers burying something illegal? Were they using my isolated home as a temporary staging ground for some dark, ongoing operation, relying on the fact that I was remote, routine-driven, and too sleep-deprived to be a threat? I will never know. I never went back to Astoria. I remotely contacted a realtor, arranged for the house to be sold as is, contents included, and took a massive financial hit. I didn't care. I couldn't risk stepping foot inside that silence again. I didn't even want the clothes or the furniture. I needed every vestige of that time erased. The sale was surprisingly quick. The realtor mentioned that the buyers seemed oddly unfazed by the property's quirks. They bought it in cash and signed the papers in 2 weeks. I now live in a 3rd-floor apartment in a densely populated suburb outside Portland. It's loud. Sirens wail constantly, neighbors argue, music thumps through the walls. I sleep with a high-powered fan running next to my bed, creating a thick, drowning wall of white noise. I am perpetually tired. The fear that was once intense and focused has become a dull, chronic ache. I have developed a severe, debilitating phobia of silence, or perhaps of what silence allows. When the noise dies down, I feel the old hypervigilance creeping back, the sensation of being observed. I cannot use voice recorders, not even for quick memos. The simple sight of a microphone icon sends a cold knot into my stomach. I tried therapy, explaining the exhaustion and the anxiety attacks, but I omitted the recordings. I couldn't risk the diagnosis of a psychotic break. I simply explained that I was unable to handle the isolation of the woods. Sometimes late at night when the white noise generator flickers and the ambient city sounds briefly fall away, I remember the precise, horrifying cadence of that whisper. Not the word itself, but the inflection. It wasn't threatening or angry. It was simply the sound of someone recognizing something precious they thought they had lost. I'm safe now in this loud, bright box of an apartment, but I know that safety is an illusion, easily shattered by darkness and a moment of deep sleep. I check my phone's battery religiously. I check the app permissions on every device I own. I live with the knowledge that for months, while I lay prone and helpless, someone else had the key to my subconscious, using my own fear and my own technology to document their quiet, unseen violation. The thought that they are still there, in that old timber house, perhaps continuing their quiet digging, is what keeps me awake. And the terrifying realization that if I hadn't decided to record my snoring, I would never have known that for months I was sleeping in a grave they were slowly preparing. I would have simply stayed there, getting quieter and quieter until one morning I failed to wake up. And somewhere, stored on some forgotten server, is the digital proof of my slow descent into being watched, documented in perfect, agonizing clarity, waiting for someone to listen and understand the chilling implication of a whispered name recorded in the dark.